story. So last time we heard those words, we were inside. Buildings that don't last. And here we are today sitting out here in all of this. Thank you. Thank you. Um, in all of this beauty, which keeps regenerating itself, it keeps resurrecting itself, it keeps on. Even when it doesn't rain for 2 weeks now, 3 weeks. It's a different perspective, isn't it? When you hear or see. I mean, it certainly was for me when we started today, and I had absolutely suddenly no idea how that song goes. I was too busy looking around. Took me a minute. It's not like we haven't sung that song thousands of times before. But it's a different place, isn't it? We're in a different space. So I think sometimes when Jesus tells those stories, when he tells parables, it's not simply because here's how you interpret that. It means this. And in fact, that story in particular, we know exactly what it means, right? Because a few moments later, in both Luke and Matthew's gospel where it appears, we'll hear Jesus tell the disciples exactly what it means. Except, and you might have heard me say this before, I have a feeling that the person who wrote the story did that. I don't see any reason. Do you see any reason why Jesus would tell people a parable? His method of teaching being to share a story with you so you'd understand that he would then have to explain later. I think the gospel writers included that explanation so that they knew that you understood it the way you're supposed to. And I think that's actually completely counter to what Jesus had in mind when he tells these stories. I think he wants you to hear and see these stories from different perspectives. I think he wants you to be able to see yourself as a character in the story, different characters perhaps in the story, not always the same one. I think he wants you to be able to read the story again and again and again and again, to have someone retell the story for you again and again and again, so that you might find something different in it each time. And not just something for you to learn because Jesus teaches, but something for you to learn about yourself. In fact, I think that's mostly the point of the parables. It's not so that Jesus will tell you what to think or how to behave. It's so that you will find in that story something that reveals something about you, something that you can connect with. So here's a classic example. It's a story where Jesus tells the parable, and then a few minutes later it appears that he explains it. But what if you just looked at the parable, maybe you heard it a couple of different ways. Maybe instead of hearing it on a Sunday morning sitting in a pew in a building, you heard it outside. A story about planting seeds, and now you're sitting out here. A little bit of a different perspective, maybe? Well, how about this? Let me offer you a couple of suggestions. Jesus told some people a parable. A wise old woman looked out her window one day. She looked up at the sun and down at the earth, and she looked at her calendar and her clock, and she said to herself, "It's time." And she picked up a large bag of seeds, and she threw it over her shoulder. She stepped out her back door, and she began tossing the seeds to the earth, spreading them out as far as she could. And when her bag was empty, she went back in the house and watched out the window, waiting. Some of the seeds landed on the path from her door. She stepped on a few, and some were eaten by the hungry birds that followed her. Some of the seeds landed on rocks where the birds didn't see them. The sun was warm and the seeds sprang to life, but there was no water there, so they just shriveled up. Some of the seeds landed among weeds. There were dandelions and crabgrass and chickweed and thistles. The weeds did very well, and it wasn't long before they overwhelmed the little seeds. Some of the seeds landed in the good soil. It was warm and wet and full of good things seeds need to grow, and they did, making a beautiful garden of the brightest flowers and the greenest leaves. Jesus paused for a moment. The people were looking at him very confused. A couple were smiling, trying hard not to laugh. "What's so funny?" Jesus asked. "Well," said one, "I'm not much of a gardener, but even I know that's a lot of wasted seed." "Yeah," said another, "I have a bit of a garden at my house, and I would be a lot more careful where I planted the seeds. If you want things to grow, you have to be careful where you plant them." This woman is anything but wise. There were nods of agreement all round, except for Jesus. "Perhaps," said Jesus, "but the seed that fell on the path fed the birds. The seed that fell on the rocks might be caught by the wind and planted elsewhere. Or, over time, perhaps enough will land there to make a little pocket of soil on the rock and start to wear it down. And the seeds in the weeds, well, what is a weed anyway? Sometimes they're important too. Besides, one or two might be strong enough to grow with the weeds. Who knows?" "Yes," said someone. "Who knows, Jesus?" You have to invest in the best location. You have to plant where you know the seed will grow. There were murmurs of agreement from the crowd. "But," said Jesus, "what if the seeds are God's love? God invests in the certainty that all creation is deserving of love, just as it is. When we live God's love in the world, each seed is like an act of love offered by you. The point is that it's offered with generosity and without condition. Wherever it lands, it has the hope of doing good, of growing more love and more generosity. Just imagine how full and beautiful the garden of earth would be if we all offered love with the generosity of this wise old gardener." So is it about the seed and the casting of the seed everywhere? Is it a parable of the sower? And is it about how we share God's love in the world? You might wonder about when you share your love with the world, you might wonder about where it lands and what happens to it. You might be reluctant to share it in certain circumstances because you're pretty sure there's weeds there or just stony ground. But there's always a place for it. And you don't know for sure, is the thing. That's what's so great about the generosity and the unconditional nature of God's love, is that it goes everywhere and can inspire and do anything. So maybe it's about the sower. Maybe it's about the seed. Or maybe Jesus told some people a parable. A wise old woman looked out her window one day. She looked up at the sun and down at the earth, and she looked at her calendar and her clock, and she said to herself, "It's time." She picked up a large bag full of seeds and, "Hang on a minute," someone interrupted Jesus. "We've heard this one before. The seeds are God's love, and they're scattered generously everywhere for everyone." There were nods and murmurs of agreement. "Tell us a new one, Jesus." "But I am," replied Jesus. "This story isn't about the seed at all. Listen." She stepped out her back door and she began tossing the seeds to the earth, spreading them out as far as she could. Some of the seeds landed on the path from her door. She remembered digging out the ground and putting in the nice flat stones to make the path. The old woman smiled to see the birds enjoying their meal. Some of the seeds landed on rocks. The wind and the rain had worn the rocks down over the years, making smooth little pockets where the seeds landed. The old woman smiled when the seeds sprang quickly to life, then just as quickly faded away. Some of the seeds landed among weeds. The old woman picked some dandelion leaves and chickweed to go with her lunch. They were fresh and delicious, and it cleared a little room for the seeds to grow. Some of the seeds landed in the good soil. Good soil, laughed the old woman. It hadn't been much before she started to take care of it, digging up the garden bed, tilling the soil, adding healthy compost and watering. She even put up a little fence to keep out the animals while things grew. And she checked every day and talked kindly to the little seedlings as they grew, wishing them sunlight and rain. It wasn't long before there was a beautiful garden thriving under her care and nurture. Jesus looked at the crowd. "How does your garden grow?" he asked. There was silence and more than a few frowns and looks of confusion. "So, we're supposed to be dirt?" said someone. "Good soil," said Jesus, "and you're supposed to be who you are. We're all different and we're all just meant to be who we are. We're valuable to creation just as we are. That's part of the great wonder in variety. See, we're just like the garden. We need to grow to flourish, to be more fully who we are. That means we need work. We need feeding and nurturing. We need to stand in the sun and sit in the earth. The world around us affects who we are and what we're like, too. And we grow together in relationship with all things. Everything comes from the earth, and the earth needs our help and care, just like we do ourselves. Love is in all things, and it grows and brings life when we're open to it. We nurture it, and we care for it. So how does your garden grow? So is it a parable of the soil? Could be. Is it a parable of Jesus that connects to so many other things that Jesus... Remember the bit about consider the lilies of the field and the birds of the air? How God feeds the birds of the air. In the story, God feeds the birds of the air by having someone cast seed where the birds are going to get it. We're part of that. The lilies grow in the field because they are planted there and they bloom where they're planted. That's us too. We're all connected. So when the service, big quotes, air quotes, part of things today is done, I expect everyone to move their chairs into at least maybe a circle or maybe randomly all over the place. I expect to see a few people take their shoes and socks off, so then put their bare feet on the earth. I'm not sure if we can we actually get to the water? If you're good at climbing down to it. Okay, so be really careful, and please, just your feet. Don't take any clothes off and go swimming. I know where I should be looking. Okay. But here we are. We're not in a building. We're not in something we fabricated to protect ourselves from this. We're in it. So take a few moments to not only celebrate that, but wonder about our connectedness to it. And wonder about what seeds you are planting and where you are planting them. Because if you're thinking about it first, and only planting seeds where you think you're pretty certain that's going to grow, that's not what God's love is about. God's love is about sharing, especially with those where you think you're going to meet the most resistance, and then offering the most nurture too.